Greetings to all our viewers tuning into our channel. There are moments in history that don't echo with the roar of cannons, nor are they marked by grand declarations in front of television cameras. They happen in silence, behind closed doors, on files stamped classified, where only a select few are allowed to be present. Yet, it is often these quiet moments that steer the course of a nation for decades, sometimes for generations. It's only in hindsight that we realize destiny took a different turn in those seemingly invisible minutes. Right now, Canada stands at such a moment. It's not war. It's not an economic crisis. It's not a financial shock or a social upheaval. It's an industrial defense decision. Dry and technical on paper, but heavy with the weight of national sovereignty. A decision that may appear to revolve around whether or not to purchase a certain fighter jet, but in truth, raises a much deeper question. Will Canada continue to be a consumer in a security order built by others, or dare to step into the role of a producer, a nation that owns, shapes, and sets the rules? For decades, Canada has been seen as a model ally, reliable, stable, and responsible. We've always shown up when needed, always fulfilled our obligations, always followed the frameworks laid out before us. But alongside the praise lies a rarely spoken reality. Canada has seldom been the one calling the shots. We buy, we assemble parts, we maintain, we operate. But the true ownership, the power to control the value chain and the future of defense industry often rests in someone else's hands. This dependence doesn't always appear obvious. It hides in export clauses, in the fine print of contracts, in invisible limits that only reveal their weight when we bump into them. And over time, this dependency becomes normalized, even accepted as the price of being in the alliance. But history has a way of confronting nations with moments of reflection, moments that force us to ask, is the security we enjoy today being bought at the cost of long-term autonomy? Is the role of follower of the order still suitable in a world that's shifting rapidly, where power is no longer measured solely by troops or warships, but by control over technology, supply chains, and core knowledge? It was in that context that in early 2025, a closed-door meeting took place in Ottawa. No press conference, no joint statement, no flashy headlines in major newspapers. But what was laid on the table in that room was enough to make power centers across the border sit up and take notice. This wasn't just a trade discussion, and it certainly wasn't a typical arms deal. It was a proposal with the potential to shake the foundations of a half-century-old structure within NATO. From that moment on, a name began to circulate in whispers through memos and strategic analysis reports: Gripen, Mirabel, Canada. And along with it, a shocking question, one that no one dared ask out loud, but everyone was thinking. Why would a fighter jet factory in Quebec be more troubling to the Pentagon than traditional military threats? The answer isn't in the aircraft itself. It lies in the seed that was just planted, a seed of silent upheaval, first sown in that February meeting. The meeting took place in February 2025 in the heart of Ottawa's winter, under an atmosphere so tightly sealed that even those close to the centers of power only caught fragments of scattered information. There were no flashy ceremonies, no handshakes in front of cameras, just a quiet conference room where representatives from Saab and Bombardier sat across from each other, not with a product catalog in hand, but with a decades-long vision. To many, it may have seemed like just another round of industrial negotiations. But for those who understand the power structure of the Western defense sector, it was something far more significant. Saab didn't come to Ottawa to sell a jet. They came with a proposal to redefine Canada's role. The message was delivered plainly and without frills. Gripen isn't just a combat platform. It's a gateway for Canada to step into the highest tier of the defense value chain. Not end-of-line assembly, not subcontracted parts, but true production, true ownership, from systems integration and software control to export rights that aren't held hostage by a third party. In this narrative, Mirabel was no longer just a cluster of factories in Quebec. It was being reimagined as a new industrial power center, a convergence point of knowledge, high-quality labor, and technological capability. The figures on the table weren't just about costs or profits, but tens of thousands of high-tech jobs, the potential to sustain a self-reliant defense industrial ecosystem, and above all, the power to decide one's own future. It was at this point that many within Canada's political machinery felt a very human hesitation. Excitement mixed with apprehension. Excitement, because this was a rare chance to break free from the role of the eternal buyer. Apprehension, because anyone who knows history understands that efforts to step beyond one's designated place almost never go unchallenged. When a smaller nation begins to touch the core layers of vested interest, pushback from the old order is nearly inevitable. The February proposal, if realized, would set an unprecedented precedent. A NATO member that isn't a military superpower becoming a hub for fighter jet production for the entire alliance. A supply chain outside Washington's direct control. An option for allies to acquire combat capabilities without the usual web of hidden political strings. This wasn't just a contest of technology, it was a contest over the power to shape the rules. From that moment, the story was no longer just about Ottawa or Mirabel. It began to ripple through other corridors of power, where the analysis wasn't written for the public, but for those charged with protecting their dominance. In internal reports, no one was asking whether Gripen was good enough or whether Bombardier had the capacity. The real question was, what happens if Canada succeeds? Because if Canada succeeds, this is no longer just a defense contract. It becomes a signal that the old order can be challenged from within the alliance itself. And it's from that realization that a deeper anxiety began to form across the border. Quietly. Unspoken, but large enough to make the Pentagon start looking north with an entirely different gaze. The Pentagon's concern didn't manifest through tough statements or flashy military maneuvers. It first surfaced in internal assessments, in the subtle shift of language behind closed-door meetings, where Canada was no longer spoken of as the gentle ally, but as a new variable that needed close monitoring. When a classified report from the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency was leaked in the spring of 2025, the shock didn't come from the specifics. It came from the final conclusion. The long-term threat to America's defense industrial dominance didn't come from Moscow or Beijing, but from a country just across the northern border. At first glance, the idea seemed absurd. Russia and China possess hypersonic missiles, massive fleets, and overt geopolitical ambitions. But precisely because of that, they aren't the real challengers in this context. They exist outside the NATO market, outside the defense budgets of Western democracies. They are military adversaries, not structural competitors. Canada is different. Canada is inside. Canada knows the rules, and more importantly, Canada has the potential to change the rules without firing a single shot. A Gripen fighter jet manufactured in Canada poses no threat to NATO's collective security. On the contrary, it strengthens the alliance's capabilities. But what worries Washington isn't the technical specifications, it's the political and economic implications behind it. A more cost-effective option, more flexible in terms of usage conditions, and free from the chokehold of invisible export restrictions, forces allied nations to ask, why are we paying more for less autonomy? For decades, America's real power in NATO hasn't just come from its military, it's come from its control of the supply chain. Who gets to buy what, when, with what configuration, and under what circumstances licenses might be withheld? All of this creates a form of soft power that is quietly but tremendously effective. It's rarely mentioned in public, but always exists like an invisible boundary. And when a nation approaches that line, the pressure becomes immediate. The Gripen-Mirabel proposal strikes directly at the heart of that mechanism. If Canada becomes the main production site for a NATO fighter jet, the default control begins to fragment. Allies gain more options. And when options appear, the power of monopoly begins to erode. For the Pentagon, this isn't about winning or losing a procurement contract. It's about the risk of losing a strategic lever that's been built up over half a century. What deepens the unease is that Canada can't simply be sidelined like an outsider. No one can openly pressure a core NORAD ally without paying a political price. No one can easily block an initiative wrapped in the language of enhancing NATO capability without exposing internal contradictions. That very entanglement forces Washington to tread carefully, and that caution only underscores the seriousness of the matter. In the corridors of power, people began talking less about airplanes and more about precedent. If Canada can do this, will other countries dare to follow? Can the current structure of dependency remain stable as more allies face tightening budgets and growing needs for strategic autonomy. These questions don't have immediate answers, but the mere fact they're being asked is enough to cause unease. And from that unease, another reality slowly emerged. It was no coincidence that the idea of Gripens made in Canada resonated so strongly. It didn't stem from a gap in the market, but from a very real, very specific need, one that had been quietly building in country after country within the alliance. When budgets are broken down, when the math of sustaining a modern air force is laid out, the conversation is no longer about abstract strategic theory. It becomes a matter of real money, real needs, and real allies searching for a practical way forward for the future of their own security. What makes the Gripen-Mirabel proposal impossible to dismiss as a theoretical gamble lies in a very simple truth. The demand has long existed, the money has already been allocated, and allied nations are simply waiting for a viable path forward. In recent years, the security map of Europe and surrounding regions has shifted faster than many air forces can adapt. Aging fleets are reaching the end of their life cycles, while the modern battle space demands rapid response, flexibility, and endurance over flashy, expensive platforms. From Eastern Europe to the Mediterranean, budget discussions now carry a very different tone compared to a decade ago. The question is no longer what's the best jet we can get, but how can we sustain combat capability for the next 30 years? For countries like Poland, Romania, or Bulgaria, the pressure doesn't only come from nearby security threats, but from harsh financial realities. Every flight hour, every maintenance cycle, every software update is a long-term expense that can drain defense budgets faster than any crisis. In this picture, Gripen emerges not as a symbol of power, but as a practical tool. Low operating costs, the ability to deploy from modest infrastructure, and flexibility in weapon and sensor integration, these features resonate with militaries that value efficiency over showmanship. But when Gripen comes with the label Made in Canada, the story instantly transcends technicalities. It carries a message of supply chain stability, of a North American partner not entangled in Europe's political turbulence, and one that doesn't impose usage conditions as leverage. And it's not just Europe. Interest is spreading to partners outside NATO. Countries like the Philippines, Chile, and Colombia face the same dilemma: how to modernize their air forces without being locked into long-term dependency. In their eyes, Canada appears as a partner strong enough to uphold its commitments, yet neutral enough not to turn every contract into a political bargaining chip. That kind of trust is rare in a world where weapons are increasingly tied to conditions and constraints. These numbers are no longer hypothetical. Budgets have been approved, replacement plans drawn, and aging squadrons await retirement. In that context, a Gripen production hub in Mirabel isn't a lofty ambition. It's a response to a very real market void. It offers nations the ability to buy combat capability without purchasing financial risk. It lets them invest in people and training rather than be drained by platform maintenance costs. And here's where the story takes on a different weight for Canada. This is no longer just about an industrial dream. It's a rare chance to align national interest with the real needs of allies, a rare opportunity to turn production capacity into strategic influence, not through coercion, but through usefulness. But history always reminds us, such opportunities never come without a price. Because Canada has seen this future once before. It has stood at the threshold of a larger role, only to be pulled back by invisible forces. When the memories of 2017 are still fresh, when a single phone call was enough to dissolve a years-long plan, the shadow of the past still quietly lingers behind every discussion. And that shadow makes the question more painful than ever. This time, is Canada ready not to repeat that costly lesson, or will history once again close the door just as it's within reach? The ghost of 2017 doesn't appear as a loud memory. It doesn't scream, doesn't judge, but it lingers, an uncomfortable silence that surfaces every time Canada inches closer to the idea of defense industrial autonomy. Back then, everything seemed to be falling into place. Technical discussions were progressing, cooperative blueprints were taking shape, and there was a growing sense that Canada was finally poised to take a major step forward in mastering military aviation capabilities. Then, in a single moment, it all came to a halt. There was no official statement explaining why, no public hearing, just a cold signal, sharp enough for the entire system to understand that there were lines not meant to be crossed. A phone call, a brief reminder to know your place. And with that, the door didn't slam shut. It simply closed, quietly, leaving behind years of silence. The lesson of 2017 wasn't about the failure of a specific project. It was the sense of helplessness that spread in its wake. Canada realized that within a deeply dependent structure, even the most carefully prepared plans could be suffocated by political pressure. No threats were needed, no sanctions, just a reminder of the unspoken order that had governed things for decades. And the most unsettling part? That truth was accepted as normal. But the world didn't stand still between 2017 and 2025. What once seemed untouchable has begun to crack. Global supply chains have been repeatedly disrupted. Allies have come to understand that absolute dependence is no longer a guarantee of security. It can be a fatal vulnerability. Nations brave enough to chart their own path are no longer isolated pariahs. Sometimes they are respected for their ability to stand firm under pressure. Canada has changed too, not with grand declarations, but with a more sober understanding of its own position. The fear that once made Ottawa hesitate is now being dissected with clarity. It wasn't a fear of lacking capacity. It was a fear of punishment for stepping beyond a familiar role. And once that fear is named, its power begins to fade. That's why, as the Gripen Mirabel proposal returned to the table, the memory of 2017 was no longer a reason to retreat. It became a warning, a reminder that dependence means vulnerability, that every time a difficult decision is avoided, a national capability is lost. This time, the question is no longer, will someone object, but how much are we willing to trade to avoid repeating the same mistake? From the shadow of the past, a new mindset has begun to take shape. No longer a vague yearning for autonomy, but a clear recognition that the defense industry isn't just about jobs or GDP growth. It generates power. It enables self-determination. It builds a position that no phone call can easily erase. When Canada starts to see Mirabel not just as a factory, but as a pillar of sovereignty in the 21st century, the ghost of 2017 begins to fade, making way for a new vision where industry is no longer a supporting role, but the foundation of a nation's revived strength. The revival of Mirabel didn't begin with grand ribbon-cutting ceremonies or speeches full of slogans. It started with a clear-eyed realization. In the 21st century, defense industry is no longer an accessory to national security policy. It is the very heart of sovereignty. A fighter jet factory is not just a place where steel is cut, assembly lines run, and robots weld. It is where knowledge is accumulated, where capability is passed from one generation to the next, and where a nation decides whether it can stand firm when the external order begins to shake. For Mirabel, that vision carries meaning far beyond its geographic location. Canada has long possessed a world-class workforce of engineers, technicians, and aerospace designers. What's been missing is not the people, it's full ownership of the value chain. When a fighter jet program is produced at Mirabel with full rights to integrate, deeply maintain, and upgrade the aircraft, knowledge is no longer locked into subcontracted contracts. It stays within the country, takes root in the domestic industrial ecosystem, and becomes an asset that cannot be stripped away by a political decision made elsewhere. In this scenario, Mirabel doesn't just create tens of thousands of high-tech jobs. It creates a professional community capable of learning, innovating, and protecting itself against external shocks. When Canadian engineers control source code, electronic warfare systems, and the integration of sensors and weapons, country enters a completely different state of being, one in which national capability cannot be paused, cannot be held hostage by licensing, and cannot be replaced overnight. This transformation also carries deep psychological meaning. For many years, Canada has grown accustomed to playing the role of contributor, supporter, supplementing the power centers of others. The Mirabel Renaissance poses a new question. If we can produce, maintain, and upgrade fighter jets for our allies, why should we limit ourselves to a dependent role? When industry becomes the backbone of security, sovereignty is no longer an abstract idea. It becomes tangible. In every production line, every lab, every generation of young engineers, trained with the belief that their skills serve the future of their country. Of course, that path is anything but smooth. Building a fighter jet production center of strategic significance means accepting long-term pressure, from market competition to geopolitical scrutiny. But it is precisely within those trade-offs that the true value of Mirabel is revealed. A nation cannot speak of autonomy unless it is willing to defend its industrial foundation against pressure, and an industry cannot become sovereign if it only exists within a comfort zone. When Mirabel is seen as a pillar of national power, the conversation begins to transcend Canada's internal context. It touches broader debates about alliance structure, about how nations collaborate without canceling each other out. Because immediately a familiar question arises: does building independent industrial capability weaken interoperability within the alliance? It is at that very boundary that the Mirabel Renaissance forces Canada to confront a long-standing myth, that there is only one path to being part of NATO, and that path always leads through total dependency. But when industry becomes sovereignty, Canada is not walking away from the alliance. It's bringing a new argument into its core. And from here, the real debate begins, between independence and interoperability, between autonomy and cooperation, and between what was once deemed impossible and what is now becoming a real, viable choice. For decades, the concept of NATO interoperability has been repeated like an unquestionable truth. It's echoed in speeches, strategic memos, and internal debates as if there were only one path to being a reliable ally: procure, integrate, and operate strictly within the framework defined by traditional power centers. By that logic, any attempt to build independent capabilities is quickly labeled a risk, a deviation, even a threat to alliance cohesion. But look closer, and this interoperability myth reveals itself to be more political than technical. Technologically, NATO's combat systems are built on open standards, designed to ensure that different forces can operate together in the same battle space. There is no NATO rule requiring a member to rely entirely on a single supplier to be considered interoperable. What's often confused or deliberately obscured is the line between military cooperation and industrial dependency. Gripen was designed from the outset to function within NATO environments. The issue has never been about radars, data links, or communication protocols. The issue is about control. Who has the authority to upgrade? Who holds the software keys? Who gets the final say when political contexts shift? When those rights are concentrated in a single center, interoperability slowly morphs into dependency, and dependency always comes with power imbalance. Canada, with its unique position in the North American security architecture and its core role in NORAD, has never been a peripheral member of the alliance. That's why the choice to build independent industrial capacity isn't a step away from NATO. It's a step into the alliance from a different posture, a posture in which Canada doesn't just contribute troops or budgets, but brings strategic value in the form of production, maintenance, and long-term sustainment for the very forces that underpin Allied strength. The uncomfortable truth for many is this: a durable alliance isn't built on total dependency, but on the ability of its members to stand on their own. When each nation can sustain its core strength independently, the alliance becomes more flexible, more resilient in crisis, and less vulnerable to political shocks. In this light, independence isn't separation. It's what makes cooperation more equal. The debate over Mirabel and Gripen, then, isn't just about a factory or a fighter jet program. It's a test of Canada's strategic mindset in the 21st century. Will we continue to believe that security comes only through strict adherence to old patterns, or are we ready to accept that a strong alliance needs autonomous, confident members, willing to contribute through their own capabilities? It is precisely at that delicate boundary that the myth of interoperability begins to give way to a more mature understanding of what an alliance means, one where independence and cohesion are not contradictions, but complements. The year 2026 is approaching, not as a predetermined historical milestone, but as a crossroads unfolding before us. At this junction, no choice is entirely easy, and no decision comes without consequence. This is no longer a technical debate, no longer a comparison of flight specs or contract figures. This is the moment when a nation must look itself in the mirror and answer a simple but weighty question. Do we want to remain protected within a framework built by others, or are we ready to shoulder the responsibility of standing on our own? For years, Canada has grown accustomed to the safety of stability. A nation that doesn't make waves, that doesn't provoke, that shows up when needed, and steps back when expected. But history shows us that pivotal moments never reward comfort. They force us to choose between preserving old inertia and embracing risk to step into a new role. The decision around Gripen and Mirabel, then, is not a reckless gamble. It is a test of whether Canada is ready to mature strategically. The shadow of the past still lingers in every discussion. Memories of buried programs and lost opportunities, sacrifice to the fear of overstepping, continue to whisper caution. But history doesn't exist to bind the present. It exists to pose an even tougher question. After all these years, what have we learned? If every lesson leads to the same conclusion, avoidance, then memory becomes just another excuse not to decide. The world of 2026 will not be forgiving to nations that only know how to passively adapt. Fragile supply chains, intense power competition, and deepening strategic uncertainty demand stronger internal foundations than ever before. In that context, a Canada that can produce, sustain, and export defense capabilities is not a threat to anyone. On the contrary, it is a Canada that can contribute more, with greater consistency and reliability, to the very partners it stands beside. This moment of choice then transcends a single political term. It will shape how future generations look back on us, as a generation that clung to the safety of the present, or one brave enough to open a new path. No one can promise that this road will be smooth, but history rarely remembers those who only chose the easiest way forward. The door is open, though no one knows for how long. The world is watching, not to judge, but to see how Canada will choose to define itself in a rapidly shifting order. And this time, no outside force will bear responsibility for that choice, but us. If you have thoughts, perspectives, or questions about this moment of decision for Canada, we invite you to share them in the comments below. This debate shouldn't be confined to closed-door meetings. It deserves to be part of a broader conversation. And if you found this analysis meaningful, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more in-depth discussions about the decisions quietly shaping the future of our world.